The stars had always called to humanity, and in the year 2247 they finally answered back. Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the Horizon Dawn, watching the impossible become reality as his ship tore through the fabric of space itself. The Harriston drive hummed beneath his feet, a revolutionary engine that bent the laws of physics and made the galaxy accessible for the first time in human history. His crew of 47 men and women represented Earth's best and brightest, handpicked for this historic mission to explore beyond the solar system and seek out new worlds for colonization. The first 3 weeks passed in wonder and excitement as they surveyed uninhabited star systems, cataloging planets and mapping resources. Then everything changed when their sensors detected an artificial structure orbiting a gas giant in the Kepler 442 system. Chief Science Officer Dr. Laura Bennett nearly fell from her chair when the data came through. The structure was massive, easily 5 times the size of any space station humanity had ever built, and it was clearly waiting for them. Captain Morrison ordered the ship to approach slowly, every weapon system armed and ready, though he suspected that if these aliens meant harm, his small exploration vessel would stand no chance. The alien ship that emerged from the station, like a massive centipede made of silver metal, its segmented body stretching for nearly 2 kilometers. A transmission came through in perfect English, which shocked Morrison almost as much as the first contact itself. The voice identified itself as Coordinator Zeth-7 of the Velith species, and it informed Captain Morrison that Earth had been under observation for over 3 centuries. Humanity was being formally invited to join the galactic community, and the Velith would serve as their guides and intermediaries. Morrison felt his heart racing as he accepted the invitation, knowing that this moment would reshape human history forever. Within days, the Horizon Dawn was escorted to a world called Kethra Prime, a planet that served as one of the regional administrative centers for something called the Galaxy Council. As they approached, Morrison and his crew stared in awe at the orbital structures surrounding the planet. Hundreds of ships from dozens of different species moved in carefully controlled patterns. In massive stations the size of cities floated in perfect formation. Dr. Bennett whispered that some of the technology she was seeing should be theoretically impossible. And Commander Ryan Pierce, the ship's combat specialist, noted grimly that any one of those stations could probably destroy Earth's entire defense fleet without breaking a sweat. The council chamber itself was an architectural marvel, a vast amphitheater that could hold thousands of beings from hundreds of different species. Morrison and a delegation of 5 officers were brought before a regional session, where they encountered aliens of every conceivable form. Some floated in tanks of liquid, others stood on multiple legs, or no legs at all, and a few existed as pure energy contained in crystalline matrices. At the center of it all floated High Curator VAs, a being that resembled a massive jellyfish with bioluminescent patterns pulsing across its translucent body. When it spoke, its voice resonated directly in Morrison's mind, bypassing the need for sound entirely. "Hi, Curator Vess. Welcomed humanity to the galactic community," with words that seemed friendly at first, but quickly turned cold and formal. The council had observed human development with interest and some concern, Vess explained, noting humanity's violent history and rapid technological advancement. The galaxy operated on principles of order and hierarchy established over 2 million years of council governance. Every species had its place, determined by age, wisdom, and technological sophistication. Humanity, as a newly spacefaring species, would be designated as Class 7 emerging civilization, which placed them near the very bottom of the galactic hierarchy. Morrison felt his stomach tighten as Vess continued, outlining the terms of Earth's integration into galactic society. The restrictions were devastating. Humanity would be permitted to colonize exactly 3 star systems, chosen by the Council based on their assessment of human needs and capabilities. Earth would be required to pay substantial resource tributes annually, contributing rare elements and materials to support galactic infrastructure. Most painfully, humans were forbidden from researching or developing certain technologies that the Council deemed dangerous or destabilizing. The list included advanced artificial intelligence, certain weapons systems, dimensional manipulation, and several fields of physics that Dr. Bennett had been hoping to explore. Any violation of these restrictions would result in severe penalties. Up to and including military intervention, Captain Morrison tried to argue. Standing before the assembled aliens and speaking passionately about humanity's right to self-determination and freedom, he pointed out that humans had developed space travel on their own without any outside help, and that they deserved the chance to chart their own course among the stars. His words were met with what could only be described as condescending amusement. Several alien delegates made sounds that their translators rendered as laughter, and High Curator Vess responded with barely concealed contempt. Every species believed itself special when first joining the galactic community, Vess explained, but all eventually learned to accept their proper place in the natural order. The Council system had maintained peace and stability for longer than human civilization had existed, and it would not be changed to accommodate the pride of newcomers. The philosophy behind the Council's iron grip became clear as Vess continued speaking. The galaxy was ancient beyond human comprehension. The elder species had long ago learned that innovation and rapid change led only to chaos and destruction. The proper path to advancement was slow, careful, and guided by those who had walked it before. Humanity's aggressive nature and enthusiasm for new technology were seen not as strengths, but as dangerous flaws that needed to be controlled and suppressed. The Council existed to protect the galaxy from itself, preventing younger species from developing weapons or technologies that could threaten the established order. Morrison and his crew returned to Earth 3 weeks later, their ship escorted by a Velith vessel to ensure they didn't deviate from the approved route. The captain's report to the United Earth government sparked immediate crisis meetings at the highest levels. President Helen Carter, former military officer who had led Earth through the unification wars 20 years earlier, listened to Morrison's account with growing anger. The terms the Council offered were little better than slavery, she declared, but the alternative was equally grim. The Council commanded hundreds of species, some of whom possessed weapons that could sterilize planets from orbit. Earth's defense fleet, built to protect against human enemies, would be utterly helpless against even a small Council force. The debates that followed tore at the heart of human society. Some argued for immediate rejection of the Council's terms, declaring that humanity should fight for its freedom no matter the cost. Others pointed out the mathematical reality. Earth had barely 50 warships, while the Council could field tens of thousands. Resistance would mean extinction, plain and simple. Religious leaders, philosophers, and ordinary citizens all weighed in, and the world watched as its leaders struggled with an impossible choice. In the end, pragmatism won over pride. President Carter, with tears in her eyes, signed the Accords of Integration, officially making Earth a subject world of the Galaxy Council. The news hit humanity like a physical blow. People took to the streets in protest, and several riots broke out in major cities before military forces restored order. In orbit above Earth, Admiral Vincent Hayes watched the chaos below and felt something cold and hard settling in his chest. Hayes had spent his entire career defending humanity from external threats. And now he was being asked to accept submission to alien overlords without firing a single shot. He began reaching out quietly to like-minded officers and civilians, people who refused to accept that humanity's story would end in subjugation. They would need time, resources, and above all, secrecy. But Hayes was determined that Earth would one day be free again, no matter what it took. 5 years had passed since humanity signed the Accords of Integration, and those years had been harder than anyone could have imagined. The 3 colony worlds that Earth was permitted to settle, Novaterra, Redemption, and Freeman's World, struggled under the weight of constant Council oversight. Every decision, every construction project, every scientific experiment had to be approved by Council observers who seemed to take pleasure in finding reasons to say no. On Novaterra, Colony Administrator Lisa Grant sat in her office and stared at the latest rejection notice. Feeling the familiar burn of helpless anger in her chest, the Quailon, observer assigned to Novaterra, was a creature named Tekmareth, who resembled a bipedal lizard with gray scales and cold yellow eyes. Tekmaroth had just shut down the colony's main fusion reactor because its energy signature exceeded permitted levels by 0.03%. The fact that this minor variance was well within normal operational parameters meant nothing to the observer, who cited Galactic Regulation 47012 as justification for the shutdown. 50,000 colonists would now face a brutal WI. Enter without adequate heat or power, and when Grant protested, Tekmaroth simply reminded her that humans were fortunate the Council allowed them to exist at all. Given their violent and destructive history, back on Earth, the technology restrictions were slowly strangling human progress. Dr. Carlos Esipa had dedicated his life to quantum computing research, and his team at the Geneva Institute had finally achieved a breakthrough that could revolutionize artificial intelligence. The new quantum processors could handle calculations that would take traditional computers millions of years to complete, opening doors to advances in medicine, engineering, and space travel. Vega was preparing to publish his findings when Council enforcers arrived at his laboratory without warning. They confiscated every piece of equipment, every data file, and every research note. Vega was arrested and sentenced to 6 months in detention as a lesson to other scientists who might consider violating the Council's prohibition on advanced artificial intelligence research. The resource tributes were bleeding Earth dry in ways that most citizens didn't fully understand. President Carter, now serving her second term, called an emergency cabinet meeting and presented figures that painted a grim picture of humanity's future. The Council demanded regular shipments of rare Earth elements, platinum group metals, and exotic materials that Earth's industry desperately needed for its own development. At current rates, the projections showed that Earth would face critical shortages within 20 years. The tributes were supposedly fair contributions to maintain galactic infrastructure. But it seemed clear to Carter and her advisors that the real purpose was to keep humanity poor, dependent. And unable to challenge Council authority, Admiral Vincent Hayes had not been idle during these 5 difficult years. Working in absolute secrecy, he had assembled a network of loyal military officers, scientists and engineers who refused to accept permanent subjugation. They called themselves the Independence Coalition, though that name was never spoken where Council surveillance might hear it. Hayes used his authority as fleet commander to establish what appeared to be routine military exercises in remote parts of the solar system. But these exercises served as cover for something far more important. Hidden research stations were being built in unmonitored asteroid fields and on rogue planets. Drifting in the darkness between stars, Dr. Nina Foster was one of the brilliant scientists working at these secret facilities. She had left her comfortable position at the Luna University to join Hayes's underground effort. Driven by the same anger and determination that motivated them all, Foster's specialty was exotic physics, and she was exploring concepts that the Council had explicitly forbidden. Her colleague Kevin Walsh, a former military engineer, worked alongside her to turn theoretical breakthroughs into practical weapons and defenses. They knew that if the Council discovered what they were doing, Earth would face immediate and overwhelming retaliation. But they also knew that without forbidden technology, humanity would never be strong enough to resist. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning when a human freighter captain named Danny Brooks refused to pay what he considered an arbitrary and excessive docking fee at a Council-controlled station. Brooks was a stubborn man who had spent 30 years in space, and he wasn't about to be cheated by some corrupt alien bureaucrat. The Velith customs official, offended by what it perceived as insolence from a member of an inferior species, made a decision that would change everything. Without warning or further negotiation, the official activated the station's defense weapons and destroyed Brooks's ship. Brooks and his crew of 17 people died instantly, vaporized in a flash of superheated plasma. The Council's ruling on the incident arrived 3 days later. After reviewing the evidence and consulting relevant regulations, the administrative court declared that the Velith official had acted appropriately under galactic law. Brooks's refusal to pay the required fee constituted a violation of station protocols, and the use of deadly force was within the official's authority. The court noted that humans needed to learn proper respect for Council regulations and that this incident should serve as an educational example. No punishment would be imposed on the Veloth official, and no compensation would be paid to the families of the dead. Crew members, The reaction on Earth and the colony worlds was explosive. Millions of people poured into the streets in spontaneous protests, demanding that their government take action against the Council. President Carter found herself facing the worst civil unrest of her political career. With crowds outside government buildings chanting for war and vengeance, she understood their anger because she felt it herself. But she also understood the terrible mathematics of power. Earth's small fleet couldn't stand against even a minor Council force. An open rebellion would lead to nothing but mass death. The Council's response to the protests demonstrated their view of humanity with brutal clarity. A fleet of 15 massive dreadnoughts appeared in orbit around Earth and took up positions above major cities. Similar fleets materialized around Nova Terra, Redemption, and Freeman's World. The ships made no threatening moves, but their presence sent an unmistakable message. High Curator Vess issued a formal statement reminding humanity that dozens of species throughout galactic history had been completely erased from existence for refusing to accept Council authority. The technology to sterilize a planet existed, Vess noted, and the Council would not hesitate to use it if humanity continued down this path of defiance. The sight of those warships hanging in the sky like swords ready to fall had exactly the effect Council intended. The protests gradually diminished as fear replaced anger. People returned to their daily lives under the shadow of alien power. But something had changed in the human spirit during those weeks of rage and helplessness. An entire generation of young people who had grown up under Council rule now understood that their masters were not just restricting humanity's freedom, but were willing to murder humans, casually and without consequence. Among these radicalized youth was Lieutenant Amy Carter, the president's own daughter, who had joined the military with the secret goal of one day fighting to free her species from bondage. Admiral Hayes watched the dreadnoughts in orbit and saw not an insurmountable obstacle but a challenge that demanded creative solutions. He increased funding to the secret research stations and accelerated the development of experimental weapons. Hayes had spent years studying the Council's history and military doctrine, and he had noticed something that gave him hope. The elder species that dominated the Council had barely advanced technologically in thousands of years. They maintained and refined the technologies they had inherited from their ancestors, but they showed little capacity for genuine innovation. The Council's greatest strength was its vast numbers and ancient knowledge, but this was also a weakness. They thought in rigid patterns, following established military doctrines that hadn't changed in millennia. Humanity's greatest advantage was the very trait that the Council found most disturbing: the human capacity for rapid adaptation and creative problem-solving. Humans had gone from primitive aircraft to interstellar spacecraft in less than 3 centuries, a pace of development that horrified the cautious elder species. If Earth could develop weapons and strategies that the Council had never encountered before, if they could fight in ways that violated every assumption about proper warfare, they might have a chance. It would require taking risks that no sane species would accept. But Hayes had come to understand that humanity's supposed recklessness might be the key to their survival. President Carter met with Admiral Hayes in a secure facility deep beneath the Alps, where Council surveillance couldn't penetrate. Hayes presented his analysis and his plans, showing her the progress that Dr. Foster, Kevin Walsh, and dozens of other scientists had made in the hidden laboratories. The weapons they were developing violated numerous Council prohibitions and incorporated theories that conventional physics said should be impossible. Carter looked at the data and saw both hope and horror. If they succeeded, Earth might win its freedom, but if they failed, the retaliation would be beyond imagination. The decision that Carter faced was the hardest of her life. She could maintain the current situation, accepting subjugation and hoping that future generations might find a peaceful path to independence. Or she could authorize Hayes to continue his preparations, knowing that conflict with the Council was becoming inevitable. She thought about Danny Brooks and his crew, murdered for the crime of arguing about a docking fee. She thought about Dr. Vega, imprisoned for trying to advance human knowledge. She thought about her daughter Amy, and all the young people who would inherit a future of permanent servitude if nothing changed. President Carter made her choice and gave Admiral Hayes the authorization he needed The Independence Coalition would continue its work, and humanity would prepare for a war that everyone said they couldn't win. The Council believed that humanity had been properly cowed by the show of force. No, but they didn't understand what they had actually accomplished. They had shown humans exactly what they were. Not benevolent guides, but Ruthel Asterisk. SS overlords who saw human life as worthless. And in doing so, they had guaranteed that humans would never stop seeking freedom, no matter how long it took or what price had to be paid. 8 years of council rule had brought humanity to the edge of a precipice. And what pushed them over was something that no amount of diplomatic pressure or economic hardship could have achieved. The council, in its ancient arrogance, decided that humanity's population growth violated what they called sustainable development protocols. High Curator Vess delivered the decree personally through a galactic broadcast that reached every human settlement simultaneously. Earth and its colonies were ordered to implement mandatory population controls immediately, limiting every family to no more than 1 child. Violations would result in severe penalties, including forced sterilization and criminal prosecution. The reaction was immediate and universal. President Helen Carter watched the riots, spreading across every continent, and knew that something fundamental had broken in the relationship between Earth and the Council. This wasn't about trade restrictions or technology bans anymore. This was about the most basic human right, the right to have children and build families without government interference. Carter called emergency meetings with religious leaders from every major faith, with ethicists and philosophers, and with representatives of the people themselves. The message she heard from all of them was the same: some lines cannot be crossed. And this was one of them. 3 days after the Council's decree, President Carter stood before the cameras and delivered an address that would echo across the galaxy. She spoke calmly but firmly, explaining that humanity had tried to work within the Council's system, had accepted restrictions and paid tributes, had swallowed their pride for 8 long years. But there were principles more important than survival, and human dignity was not negotiable. Carter declared that Earth would no longer comply with Council directives that violated fundamental human rights. She announced that the Accords of Integration, signed under duress and maintained through threats of violence, were null and void. Earth was reasserting its sovereignty effective immediately. The Council's response came within hours. High Curator Vess appeared in another broadcast, its bioluminescent patterns pulsing with what seemed like anger. The Curator gave humanity 48 hours to rescind the declaration and reaffirm their commitment to Council authority. If President Carter refused, the consequences would be severe and permanent. Vess spoke of humanity as if they were misbehaving children who needed to be disciplined, and the condescension in every word only strengthened Carter's resolve. When the deadline expired with no response from Earth, the Council ordered a complete blockade of all human space. Every trade route was cut off, every communication channel blocked. And Council warships took up positions around Earth and the 3 colony worlds. Admiral Vincent Hayes had been waiting for this moment for 8 years. The instant the blockade was announced, he activated protocols that the Independence Coalition had prepared in absolute secrecy. Hidden military installations throughout human space suddenly began broadcasting their existence, revealing that humanity had been far from idle during the years of occupation. Dozens of new warship designs constructed in secret shipyards hidden in asteroid belts and on remote moons emerged from concealment and began moving into formation. The fleet that assembled around Earth was unlike anything the galaxy had seen, incorporating technologies that the Council had forbidden and design philosophies that defied conventional military thinking. The flagship of this new fleet was the ESS Defiance, a battleship that represented everything Admiral Hayes and his scientists had accomplished. The ship's commander was Captain Grace Anderson, a brilliant tactical officer who had trained at the covert military academy that Hayes had established on a hidden moon of Saturn. Anderson was only 32 years old, young for such responsibility, but she had proven herself in countless simulations and possessed an intuitive understanding of 3-dimensional combat that bordered on genius. Her weapons officer was Lieutenant Marcus Webb, a mathematical prodigy who could calculate firing solutions in his head faster than most computers, Her chief engineer was Commander Olivia Stone, who understood the revolutionary new systems aboard the Defiance better than anyone, except the scientists who had designed them. The Council was initially unconcerned by humanity's show of defiance. High Curator Vess convened a special session and authorized the deployment of a standard enforcement fleet to suppress what they considered a minor rebellion. 50 warships, representing a dozen Council species, assembled under the command of Velcommander Korsh, a veteran officer who had participated in hundreds of police actions against defiant species over his long career. Korsh reviewed the intelligence reports on human capabilities and concluded that the operation would be concluded within hours. The human ships might incorporate some novel features, but they were outnumbered and facing opponents with millions of years of accumulated military experience. The two fleets met in the Freeman's World system, where human colonists watched from their settlements as the battle unfolded in orbit above them. Velcommander Korsh arranged his ships in a traditional battle formation that had been refined over countless conflicts, a sphere that allowed for mutual support in overlapping fields of fire. He expected the humans to either flee or attempt a desperate frontal assault, and he had prepared responses for both scenarios. What he didn't expect was for Captain Anderson to do something that violated every principle of rational military tactics. The human fleet split into 3 groups and attacked from different angles simultaneously, but they didn't try to engage the Council ships directly. Instead, Anderson activated devices that her crew called gravity well generators, experimental technology that Dr. Nina Foster had developed in the hidden laboratories. Suddenly, artificial gravity fields appeared throughout the battle space, pulling Council ships off course and into collision trajectories with each other. Korsh watched in horror as 2 of his dreadnoughts, unable to compensate for the unexpected gravitational forces, crashed into each other at high speed. The impacts destroyed both vessels instantly, killing thousands of crew members, before Korsh could reorganize his formation. The human ships launched a second wave of weapons that the Council had never encountered. Clouds of microscopic machines, each one barely larger than a molecule, spread through the battle space and began infiltrating the Council vessels through ventilation systems and damaged hull sections. Within minutes, alien computer systems started experiencing cascading failures as the nanobots rewrote programming and severed critical connections. Ships that had been fully operational suddenly found themselves blind and helpless, their sensors dead and their weapons offline. Lieutenant Marcus Webb coordinated the final phase of the attack with brutal efficiency. The human ships had been equipped with focused electromagnetic pulse weapons that Dr. Carlos Vega designed before his imprisonment. These weapons didn't try to penetrate Council shields with brute force. Instead, they emitted precisely calibrated pulses that exploited resonance frequencies and the exotic materials that Council ships used for shielding. The shields didn't just fail, they actively conducted the energy into the ship's internal systems, frying electronics and overloading power cores. The Battle of Freeman's World lasted 3 hours and ended with the complete destruction of the Council enforcement fleet. Velcommander Korsh's flagship was among the few vessels that managed to escape, limping away with massive damage and carrying news of an impossible defeat. The human fleet had sustained some damage and lost 1 destroyer, but they had achieved something that no species in recorded galactic history had accomplished. They had defeated a Council military force in open combat, and they had done it decisively. The news spread across the galaxy at the speed of light, carried by automated Council communication systems that couldn't be censored quickly enough. On thousands of worlds, beings who had accepted Council authority as an unchangeable fact of existence suddenly confronted a new and disturbing reality. If humans could win, if these newcomers, who had been members of galactic civilization for less than a decade, could destroy experienced Council forces, then perhaps the Council wasn't invincible after all. High Curator Vess convened an emergency session of the full Council, something that hadn't happened in over 10,000 years. Representatives from all 847 member species gathered in person or through holographic projection. Filling the massive Council chamber on Kethra Prime, the debate that followed revealed deep divisions that had been hidden beneath the surface of Council unity for centuries. Some species demanded immediate and overwhelming retaliation, arguing that humanity must be crushed completely to prevent other species from following their example. Others counseled caution, pointing out that the humans had clearly been preparing for this conflict for years and might have additional surprises waiting in the end. Pride and fear won over prudence. The council voted to assemble an armada unlike anything deployed in living memory. 500 warships from the 40 most powerful council species would be gathered and sent to the Sol system under the command of Grand Marshal Keth-9 of the Korth Dominion. The Korth were one of the eldest species in the galaxy, and their military traditions stretched back millions of years. Keth-9 was considered one of the finest strategic minds in council space, and he was given absolute authority to do whatever was necessary to neutralize the human threat. The message to humanity would be clear and final. Defiance leads only to destruction on Earth. The celebrations following the victory at Freeman's World were tempered by the knowledge of what was coming. President Carter addressed the world once again, acknowledging that humanity now faced a challenge that would determine their survival as a species. Admiral Hayes analyzed the intelligence reports about the gathering armada and knew that conventional warfare could not prevail against such overwhelming numbers. 500 council warships represented more firepower than humanity could possibly counter through traditional means. Even with all the technological advantages they had developed in secret, Dr. Nina Foster and her team worked around the clock on what they called Project Prometheus, a desperate plan that would require pushing experimental technology far beyond its tested limits. Kevin Walsh coordinated with military commanders across all of human space, preparing contingencies within contingencies. Captain Grace Anderson drilled her fleet relentlessly, knowing that they would need to perform perfectly when the Council Armada arrived. Every human settlement from Earth to the furthest colony was mobilized, with civilians and military personnel alike understanding that they were facing an existential threat. The Council's grand Armada began its journey toward human space, and every day brought the inevitable confrontation closer. Humanity had won the first battle, but the real war was just beginning, and the outcome would determine whether humans would live free or cease to exist at all. The Council's grand Armada arrived at the edge of the Sol system after 2 weeks of travel, and Grand Marshal Keth-9 surveyed the human defenses from the bridge of his massive dreadnought, Eternal Authority. The Korth commander had expected to find humanity's fleet arranged in desperate defensive formations around Earth, protecting their homeworld with everything they had. Instead, the human warships had withdrawn entirely, with most vessels positioned near Mars and scattered throughout the asteroid belt. Keth-9 found this puzzling but not particularly concerning. Perhaps the humans hoped to draw the Council fleet deeper into the system, where they could use the terrain to their advantage. Or perhaps they simply had no coherent strategy and were buying time before the inevitable surrender. The Grand Marshal had spent the journey studying every detail of the Battle of Freeman's World, analyzing how Velcommander Korsh had been defeated so thoroughly. The Council military command had identified human tactics that violated traditional combat doctrine, weapons that exploited unexpected vulnerabilities in Council technology, and a willingness to take risks that bordered on suicidal. Keth-9 had adapted his strategy accordingly, reinforcing shield systems against electromagnetic weapons, developing countermeasures for human nanobots, and drilling his captains on responding to unconventional attacks. He was confident that human tricks would not work a second time against prepared and experienced Council forces as the Armada advanced toward the inner system. Captain Grace Anderson aboard the ESS Defiance initiated the first phase of humanity's defense plan. Hidden throughout the Sol system were thousands of small platforms that had been deployed over the past 2 weeks, positioned at carefully calculated locations. These platforms suddenly activated in perfect synchronization, projecting massive holographic images into space. The Council fleet found itself apparently surrounded by phantom vessels, hundreds of human warships that sensors indicated couldn't possibly be real, but which looked convincing enough to force a cautious response. Grand Marshal Keth-9 ordered his fleet to slow its advance and begin detailed scans to identify actual threats among the illusions. The delay was exactly what humanity needed. While Council sensors worked to distinguish real ships from holograms, The second wave of defense is activated. Throughout the system, thousands of devices that Dr. Nina Foster called gravitational anomaly generators began creating localized distortions in space-time. These weren't the simple gravity wells used at Freeman's World, but something far more sophisticated and dangerous. Council ships suddenly found themselves caught in artificial gravity fields that crushed their hulls, like tin cans, or slingshot them off course at impossible angles. The precise formation that the Armada had maintained began to break apart as captains struggled to navigate through a constantly shifting maze of gravitational hazards. Grand Marshal Kethnine felt frustration replacing his initial confidence as he watched his carefully planned advance dissolve into chaos. These were nuisance tactics, he told himself, not a real defense capable of stopping 500 warships. He ordered the fleet to push forward toward Earth at maximum speed, accepting that they would take some losses, but knowing that once they reached orbit around the human homeworld, this nonsense would end. The Council would demonstrate its power by making Earth's population witness their own helplessness, and humanity would learn the price of defiance. That was when Admiral Vincent Hayes sprang the real trap and unleashed Project Prometheus upon the galaxy. Every human settlement across 3 star systems, every colony and station and mining outpost, simultaneously launched what appeared to be a desperate evacuation. Thousands of civilian vessels, freighters and passenger ships, and personal craft, all equipped with experimental faster-than-light drives, jumped toward the Sol system in a coordinated movement that had been planned down to the second. Grand Marshal Kethnine initially interpreted this as confirmation that humanity was abandoning its outer settlements to concentrate all forces for a final stand at Earth. But within minutes he realized his terrible mistake. The civilian ships weren't evacuating at all. They were attacking. Dr. Carlos Viga's breakthrough in quantum computing had allowed human engineers to network millions of individual vessels into a single distributed intelligence. Each ship was controlled by a fragment of artificial intelligence, working in perfect coordination with thousands of others to create a swarm that behaved like a living organism. The civilian fleet, packed with conventional explosives and accelerated to maximum velocity, transformed into an intelligent missile storm that descended upon the Council Armada from every direction simultaneously. The Council fleet, designed for traditional warfare between organized battle groups, had no doctrine for responding to such an attack. Point defense systems that could icily destroy a few dozen incoming missiles were overwhelmed by thousands of targets, each one maneuvering unpredictably and coordinating with its neighbors to exploit gaps in defensive fire. Grand Marshal Kethnine watched in horror as wave after wave of human civilian ships slammed into Council vessels. Each impact was relatively small, but the cumulative effect was devastating. Shields failed under repeated strikes, hulls breached, and critical systems were destroyed by ships that came screaming out of nowhere with suicidal precision. Captain Anderson chose that moment to bring the military fleet out from behind Mars, striking at the Council formation while it reeled under the swarm attack. The human warships had been equipped with weapons that Dr. Foster called stellar lances, focused particle beam weapons that drew power directly from the sun itself through a massive array of collection satellites, positioned in close solar orbit. Each lance blast carried the energy of a small nuclear weapon, concentrated into a beam narrow enough to punch through Council shields as if they didn't exist. The Defiance led the charge, with Lieutenant Marcus Webb coordinating firing solutions that exploited every gap in enemy defenses created by the swarm attacks. The Battle of Sol became a massacre that would be studied by military historians for generations. Within 5 hours of engagement, over 200 Council ships had been destroyed or crippled beyond repair. The vaunted Grand Armada, assembled from the finest vessels of 40 species and commanded by one of the Council's most respected officers, was being systematically torn apart by an enemy that fought with terrifying efficiency and no regard for conventional limitations. Grand Marshal Kethnine, his own flagship heavily damaged and listing as its artificial gravity failed, made the hardest decision of his long military career and ordered the retreat. The surviving Council ships fled the Sol system in disorder, leaving thousands of dead floating in the void and countless damaged vessels drifting helplessly among the debris. Admiral Hayes immediately broadcast a message on all frequencies, ensuring that every Council world would receive it within days. Humanity did not seek conquest or domination of other species, Hayes declared, and had no desire to build an empire or subjugate others. All that humans wanted was to be left alone, to develop freely according to their own values, to be treated as equals rather than subjects. Any Council force that approached human space in the future would be destroyed just as thoroughly as this armada had been. Earth was no longer a subject world answering to alien masters. Earth was free, and would remain free no matter what the cost. The message resonated across the galaxy in ways that Admiral Hayes had never anticipated. On hundreds of Council worlds, younger species that had lived under the same restrictions and humiliations that humanity rejected began questioning whether their submission was truly necessary. If these newcomers could defeat the Council's greatest military force, if humans who had been spacefaring for less than a decade could shatter an armada of 500 ships, then perhaps the Council's power was not as absolute as everyone had been taught to believe. Protests erupted on dozens of worlds, with younger species demanding the same freedoms that humanity had claimed for itself. Curator Vess and the Council's inner leadership watched their carefully maintained order beginning to fracture. In emergency sessions that lasted for days, they debated how to respond to this unprecedented crisis. Some argued for negotiation, suggesting that humanity might be satisfied with independence and could be persuaded to remain neutral in galactic affairs. Others insisted that any compromise would be interpreted as weakness and would encourage more rebellions. The hardliners won the argument, pointing out that if the Council backed down now, their entire system of governance would collapse within a generation. The vote was nearly unanimous when it finally came. Humanity was declared an existential threat to galactic civilization, and the Council authorized total war with no restrictions on methods or weapons. They would mobilize forces from all 847 member species, assembling a fleet of 5,000 warships that would dwarf anything previously seen in the galaxy. This time there would be no police action or limited engagement. The Council fleet would sterilize Earth and every human colony, eliminating humanity completely as a warning to any other species that might consider following their example. Better to destroy one troublesome species now than allow their ideas to spread and bring down the order that had maintained galactic peace for millions of years. President Helen Carter received intelligence about the Council's plans from sympathetic aliens who secretly admired what humanity had accomplished. The numbers were beyond terrifying. Even with Project Prometheus and all their technological advantages, humanity could not possibly defeat 5,000 warships representing hundreds of different species and technologies. The human fleet numbered less than 300 vessels. And while they had won 2 stunning victories, everyone knew that overwhelming numerical superiority would eventually prevail. Earth's freedom, so dearly bought, might be measured in months rather than years. Admiral Hayes convened an emergency meeting with his senior commanders and top scientists. Captain Anderson was there, still wearing her combat uniform and showing the exhaustion of the recent battle. Dr. Foster and Kevin Walsh presented projections that confirmed what everyone feared, that in a prolonged war of attrition, humanity would lose. The room fell silent as people contemplated the bleak future ahead. Then Commander Amy Carter, President Carter's daughter, who had distinguished herself during the Battle of Seoul, spoke up with an idea that was either brilliant or insane. What if humanity didn't wait for the Council to bring the war to Earth? What if instead of defending, humans attacked the Council's center of power directly and forced them to choose between accepting human independence or watching their own core worlds burn? The strategy violated every principle of defensive warfare, but it offered something that passive defense could not: the possibility of victory through audacity rather than attrition. Admiral Hayes looked around the room at the faces of humanity's defenders and saw determination replacing despair. Earth would not wait to be destroyed. Earth would strike first and make the Council regret that they had ever tried to enslave humanity. While the Council mobilized its massive fleet of 5,000 warships, Admiral Vincent Hayes launched Operation Vindication with a boldness that would have seemed suicidal to any conventional military strategist. The human plan was unprecedented in galactic history because instead of defending their homeworld and colonies, they would attack Council core worlds simultaneously and demonstrate that if the Council insisted on total war, no species in the galaxy would be safe from retaliation. Hayes divided his forces into two strike groups, each with a mission that could reshape the balance of power forever. Commander Amy Carter led the first strike force of 30 stealth ships toward Kethra Prime, the Council's administrative capital, where billions of aliens lived and worked in the vast bureaucracy that governed galactic civilization. Her fleet included the ESS Revolution, commanded by Captain Peter Logan. They carried a prototype weapon that Dr. Nina Foster and her team had developed in absolute secrecy. The quantum disruptor was designed to disable all advanced technology on a planetary scale without harming any organic life. And if it worked as intended, it would paralyze the Council's government completely. The stealth ships used revolutionary cloaking technology that bent quantum signatures rather than just visible light, making them invisible to every sensor system the Council possessed. Commander Carter watched the displays as her fleet slipped past defense stations and orbital platforms, moving through layers of security that should have been impenetrable. The tension on every bridge was unbearable, because if even one ship was detected, the entire operation would fail, and they would all die deep in enemy territory. But the human technology held, and 30 ships reached their positions around Kethra Prime without triggering a single alarm. Meanwhile, Captain Grace Anderson led the main battle fleet toward Velthorum, the massive shipyards where the Council's 5,000-ship armada was being assembled. Her mission was more direct and far more dangerous because the shipyards were defended by 300 warships and countless automated defense platforms. The S-Defiance led the attack, and Anderson knew that many of her people would not survive the next few hours. She had volunteered for this mission knowing the odds, and every member of her crew had done the same, because they understood that Earth's freedom depended on their success. The two strikes were launched simultaneously across hundreds of light years. On Kethra Prime, Commander Carter gave the order, and the quantum disruptors activated in perfect synchronization. The effect was instantaneous and total. Across the entire planet, every computer and vehicle and piece of advanced technology simply stopped functioning. The Council's central bureaucracy, which had coordinated galactic affairs for 2 million years, went completely dark. High Curator Vess found itself trapped in its own chambers as even the door mechanisms failed. And across the planet, billions of beings experienced the sudden loss of technology they had taken for granted their entire lives. But Commander Carter didn't destroy anything or harm anyone. Instead, she broadcast a message directly into every home on Kethra Prime using emergency systems that still functioned. Humanity could have destroyed this world, Carter told them, could have killed everyone here without warning. Humans chose not to because, despite what the Council believed, humanity valued life and sought peace rather than conquest. How many of your own species would have shown the same restraint, she asked. And how many of you have wondered whether the Council's rigid control serves your interests or only preserves the power of the eldest species? The message was carefully designed to exploit divisions that human intelligence had identified within Council society. Many younger species privately resented the hierarchy that kept them subordinate to ancient civilizations. Now, humanity was offering them an alternative vision of what galactic civilization could be. A galaxy where innovation was celebrated rather than feared, where species could develop freely rather than following paths laid down millions of years ago, and where worth was measured by merit rather than age. At Velthorum, Captain Anderson faced a conventional battle that was brutal beyond anything humanity had experienced. The shipyard's defenders fought with desperate fury because they understood that if the yards were destroyed, the Council's ability to wage war would be crippled. The Defiance took hit after hit as it pushed deeper into the enemy formation. And Commander Olivia Stone watched damage reports flooding in from every section of the ship. She made the agonizing decision to reroute all power from engines to weapons and shields, accepting that they might never be able to retreat, but maximizing their ability to hurt the enemy. Lieutenant Marcus Webb coordinated strikes with mathematical precision that bordered on precognition, targeting structural weak points that human analysis had identified in Council ship designs. Human vessels were destroyed one after another, each loss representing hundreds of trained personnel who had volunteered for this mission knowing they might not return. The battle raged for 6 brutal hours. By the end, the human fleet had been reduced to 18 surviving ships out of the 70 that had attacked. But the shipyards were destroyed, burning wrecks drifting in orbit, and the 5,000 ships that were supposed to destroy Earth would never fly. News of both strikes spread across the galaxy faster than light itself. Carried by the same communication networks that the Council used to maintain its control, the impossible had happened again, and this time humanity had struck at the very heart of Council power. On thousands of worlds, beings who had accepted Council authority their entire life had identified within Council society. Many younger species privately resented the hierarchy that kept them subordinate to ancient civilizations. Humanity was offering them an alternative vision of what galactic civilization could be. A galaxy where innovation was celebrated rather than feared, where species could develop freely rather than following paths laid down millions of years ago, and where worth was measured by merit rather than age. At Velthorum, Captain Anderson faced a conventional battle that was brutal beyond anything humanity had experienced. The shipyard's defenders fought with desperate fury because they understood that if the yards were destroyed, the Council's ability to wage war would be crippled. The Defiance took hit after hit as it pushed deeper into the enemy formation, and Commander Olivia Stone watched damage reports flooding in from every section of the ship. She made the agonizing decision to reroute all power from engines to weapons and shields, accepting that they might never be able to retreat but maximizing their ability to hurt the enemy. Lieutenant Marcus Webb coordinated strikes with mathematical precision that bordered on precognition, targeting structural weak points that human analysis had identified in Council ship designs. Human vessels were destroyed one after another, each loss representing hundreds of trained personnel who had volunteered for this mission knowing they might not return. The battle raged for 6 brutal hours. By the end, the human fleet had been reduced to 18 surviving ships out of the 70 that had attacked. But the shipyards were destroyed, burning wrecks drifting in orbit, and the 5,000 ships that were supposed to destroy Earth would never fly. News of both strikes spread across the galaxy faster than light itself, carried by the same communication networks that the Council used to maintain its control. The impossible had happened again, and this time humanity had struck at the very heart of Council power. On thousands of worlds, beings who had accepted Council authority their entire lives suddenly confronted the reality that humans had attacked core Council worlds and survived. More than survived, they had achieved their objectives and demonstrated both military capability and moral restraint that many Council species had never shown. On Kethra Prime, as systems gradually came back online over several days, High Curator Vess faced something the Council had not experienced in its entire existence. Young aliens across hundreds of worlds were protesting in the streets, demanding an end to the war with humanity. They had seen that humans, despite being labeled primitive and violent by Council propaganda, had shown mercy when they could have committed genocide. The contrast with the Council's plan to exterminate humanity completely was stark, and many younger species were questioning which side truly represented civilization, with humanity as one of its founding members. The coalition was smaller and weaker than the Council, but it offered something that attracted younger species: the freedom to chart their own course among the stars. Admiral Hayes, his mission accomplished and his forces depleted, accepted an honorable retirement as a hero of humanity. Captain Anderson was promoted to admiral and given command of Earth's expanding fleet, tasked with defending human space and supporting their new allies. Commander Amy Carter, following in her mother's footsteps, entered politics with the goal of building peaceful relationships with the species that had supported human independence. President Carter, in her final address before leaving office after serving the maximum terms allowed, reflected on what humanity had achieved and what it meant for the future. They had not just won their freedom, she told the people of Earth and the colonies. They had shattered the assumption that elder civilizations had an inherent right to dominate younger ones. Humans had proven that courage and innovation could triumph over tradition and overwhelming force, and in doing so, they had given hope to countless other species who had accepted subjugation as inevitable. Dr. Nina Foster and Dr. Carlos Vega, released from any restrictions on their research, opened their work to the entire galaxy. Scientists from dozens of species began collaborating with human researchers, creating a renaissance of innovation that the galaxy had not seen in millions of years. Breakthroughs in artificial intelligence, energy generation, and faster-than-light travel came rapidly as species that had been forced to follow rigid guidelines suddenly had freedom to experiment and take risks. Monuments were erected across Earth in the colonies to honor those who had died in the fight for freedom. Danny Brooks, the freighter captain whose murder had catalyzed the final crisis, was remembered alongside the thousands who gave their lives in the battles of Freeman's World, Sol, and Velthorum. Their sacrifice had purchased something precious beyond measure: the right for humanity to determine its own destiny without asking permission from anyone. President Carter met privately with Ambassador Zeth 7 in the final days of her presidency, and the Velith diplomat expressed gratitude for what humanity had accomplished. Even Zeth 7's own people had forgotten what it meant to think freely and question authority, the ambassador admitted, and humans had reminded them that freedom was worth any price. Carter responded that freedom could never be given as a gift because anything given could be taken away just as easily. Freedom had to be claimed and defended, sometimes through diplomacy and sometimes through force, but always with the understanding that it was the most fundamental right of any conscious being. As their conversation ended, both leaders looked toward the future with hope tempered by realism. New human colonies were being established in dozens of star systems, and exploration vessels pushed deeper into unknown regions of the galaxy. Across Council space, on worlds that had accepted their place in the hierarchy for millions of years, younger species watched humanity's expansion and dared to dream of their own liberation. The galaxy would never return to the static order that had existed before Earth's fury shook the stars. And while uncertainty replaced the old stability, it also brought possibility. The story of how humanity won its freedom became legend, told and retold across 1,000 worlds and 1,000 different languages. Some versions emphasized the brilliant tactics and revolutionary technology, while others focused on the moral courage to show restraint when genocide would have been easier. But all versions agreed on the essential truth that a young species, barely a century into its journey among the stars, had refused to accept subjugation and had changed the galaxy forever through determination and sacrifice that would echo through the ages.